We're joined now by the Reverend Al Sharpton, the founder and president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation on MSNBC Sundays at 8 a.m. Rev, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
The breaking news is that the police officer, Betty Shelby, is being charged by the DA in Tulsa with manslaughter in the Terrence Cutcher shooting. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's a swift step in the right direction in the pursuit of justice. And I think that clearly when you look at the videotape, there is clearly enough probable cause for charge. We will see what happens at trial. The family was in New York yesterday. They came to the headquarters of National Action Network, met with me and had a press conference. And we said we'd be rallying this weekend calling for justice. I will still be going to Tulsa to join the family next week. I talked with one of the lawyers a few minutes ago. I also want to see, though, an examination of the officers that were with the policewoman that has been charged, whether there's any disciplinary or legal exposure there. Now, you contrast this with the slow pace of the release of tapes in Charlotte and the fact that we still have no release of tapes to the public. We see the families going in and the family attorneys saying, well, let's see what's there. When you can contrast Tulsa moving within less than a week, charging the policeman looking at a tape, and it's not happening in Charlotte, that is what exacerbates a lot of the tension and makes people feel that if you are not showing something, you might be hiding something. And I think that that's the problem. The irony is that it's a black officer and some blacks in leadership in the police department in Charlotte. So it's an institutional problem as well as a race problem with policing in this country.
Reverend Sharpton, what can be done to lower the level of violence in the protests in North Carolina?
I think transparency. I think that when people feel that they're getting the facts, no matter what the facts may be, that the level of anxiety is lowered. I think when they see today what has happened in Tulsa and what is not happening in Charlotte, again, with even officers of their own kind, but that clearly institutionally react differently in black neighborhoods than white, even when you're black, I think it increases the frustration and the anxiety.
What are you seeing happening? Obviously, when one of these horrible shootings occurs, it's a tragedy and we focus on the victims and on the immediate nature. But since we've been dealing with this for months and governments have been talking about it, what do you see happening, if anything, at the federal, state, or local level that encourages you to try to deal with these situations before they occur?
I think that when I look at the President's Commission on Policing and the recommendations they came out with, and he had met with many of the civil rights leaders and activists and others and formed this commission, if those recommendations are to be followed, I think we can make real progress. I hope it's at the center of one of the segments of the debate Monday night to see if Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump will commit that they will uphold those recommendations and they will recommend to law enforcement around the country they be implemented and translated into law. What we've not seen is a movement in this area. Even Ryan has been stalling on bringing about the sentencing reform bill, which is bipartisan.
You clearly think the videotape in the Charlotte shooting should be released.
I think it should be released. I think that it should have been released immediately, and I think this is the case around the country. I know the attorneys for the family in Charlotte has taken a more cautious view, but I think that when the public feels that there's transparency, that's the idea of saying we want body cameras. Right. It's so that the public will be able to see. It also protects the police if, in fact, the police have done nothing that is questionable.
Well, and also, Al, it really, I think, removes the element of volatility and the suspicions that you were talking about before. And the suspicions breed the volatility that we saw last night in the streets, right? So even if they're damning, even if the video is damning, having it out there lessens the chances of things happening.
It lessens it. And I don't condone violence under any circumstance, but we understand the frustration, which may also now reach a different kind of conversation. With Tulsa charging, I can see people in Charlotte saying, well, wait a minute, now what is the problem?
Right. What do you think, how do you think that if the tape were released and the tape were to show that the Mr. Scott, right, Keith Lamont Scott, if he were holding a gun, as police have some have claimed, how would that change the narrative?
I think it changes the narrative that a lot of people will say, fine, that there's nothing here, but there's still an institutional problem because this is not the first case in Charlotte. Some will, no matter what happened, be angry because of the delay. But I also think that they put themselves in a very precarious position by not coming forward quickly, because now everyone will always question, well, why did it take you so long to release the tape? And I think these are the kinds of things that we want to hear the candidates talk about, particularly when you have Donald Trump now re-entering stop and frisk to the dialogue, to the political dialogue, which was found not only by those of us that led the protests and the marches in New York to get rid of stop and frisk. A federal judge said it was discriminatory and unconstitutional in his hometown. And this becomes his criminal justice police position.
I want to come back to Trump and Pence in a minute, but I want to go back even further than that to a comment you made earlier about, this is a case where you have a black officer and a black victim. And you made a point about there's an institutional problem here. This isn't clearly a racial problem, or at least the racial problem is subsumed in a broader institutional thing.
Just say, race is still there.
Say more about that, about how.
I think the institutional problem is where you're set up where police seem to operate, where they are outside of the transparency and scrutiny that gives the community confidence that they are there as their partner, not there as some occupied force, black or white. Right. And they have this blue wall of silence, we call it in New York, that we're going to protect each other rather than we're there to uphold the law. That's an institutional problem. Black cops operate in black communities differently than they do in white communities. You'd have to ask yourself, if that same black officer that killed Scott, if he was in a white area in North Carolina and saw white, he says with a gun, and I don't know that Scott had a gun or not, but let's say he did, would he not have asked that guy, do you have a permit for a gun? Because you can carry guns in North Carolina. Right. Why would he shoot? Right. And I think that those are the questions that lead to a lot of the protests and, unfortunately, to violence.
In both, in terms of the terrorist incidents that have happened here, particularly this incident that happened here in New Jersey, New York, people have talked about the notion that there's a kind of a shoot to wound as opposed to shoot to kill in certain circumstances. In other situations, we seem to have more of a shoot to kill kind of phenomenon. Do you see that there's a kind of a dichotomy between those two? And just talk about that and how the police approach not just being quick on the trigger, but how they use their guns in certain circumstances.
When you look at inside of 1 week that you have a terrorist attack by many's definition in New York and New Jersey, and this guy shot at police, right, and they wounded him and take him in. And you have a guy whose car broke down in Tulsa, hands up, and he's killed after being tasered. You have to ask yourself, what is the police policy? What is being done in training? And why is it different strokes for different folks, as we like to say? Clearly, the man brought in on the attacks in New York, in Chelsea, and in New Jersey was a danger. He was imminent danger. He was shooting at policemen, and they found a way to bring him in alive. You couldn't find a way to bring a man alive whose car broke down, and you have a policeman in a helicopter looking down on a guy saying he looks like a bad dude. How does he look like a bad dude with his hands up, but is not a bad dude that was shooting at police in New York? Many of us see that as a real graphic example of the difference in how people treat situations differently in law enforcement.
So Donald Trump has talked in a slightly softer tone about some of these things over the last 48 hours, but in some cases he has talked with a less soft tone. You mentioned the stop and frisk point. The other point today in Pittsburgh, he said that drugs have been a very, very big factor in what you're seeing on television these last couple nights. How do you react to the notion that drugs have been a big factor?
Well, first of all, I think that when you bring up stop and frisk, that has been proven to be discriminatory by even the courts. A white male named Bill de Blasio beat a black in a primary in New York because Bill de Blasio came out against stop and frisk and the black candidate didn't. So how Mr. Trump, who lives in New York, and I assume votes here, didn't know the difference here is beyond me. But when you look at the fact that he brings up drugs, drugs was a factor where? there's the allegation that in Tulsa that the victim had drugs in the car. Well, unless the policeman had X-ray vision, that had nothing to do with him being tasered or shot. So where is Trump getting this
I think
from?
he's suggesting that drugs are fueling some of the rioting or some of the disturbances on the streets in Charlotte. I think that's what he's suggesting.
All right, even
I'm not
if
validating
he suggests
it.
there, then by what evidence is he bringing this up? And is this not fitting into the stereotyping of drugs and blacks and supporting a lot of this is also why we have to frisk them? The irony is he brings up stop and frisk in the middle of these shootings when there were no stop and frisk issues at all. In Charlotte, they stopped this guy with a bullet and frisked him after he was dead. Yeah. So I don't even know where he went and got stop and frisk, other than if that's his solution to gun violence. And that has been proven in New York. Stop and frisk has gone down from almost 700,000 stops to under 20,000, and crime has gone down. So it doesn't even answer the gun violence argument.